The encounter. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a muted, gray light over the city as Zayden slowly walked along the worn path that led to his small, crumbling neighborhood. It was a walk he had made countless times before, yet today it felt different. The wind had picked up, chilling him through his thin jacket, and the sound of his footsteps against the cracked concrete seemed to echo in the stillness around him. The city, with its towering buildings and busy streets, had always seemed distant to him, a world that was not his own. His home, a small apartment on the edge of the slum, was a place where survival was the only focus, and happiness was often hard to come by. Zayden's mother worked long hours in a factory on the other side of the city. Though she loved him dearly, there was little time for family moments. She was always exhausted when she came home, and Zayden had grown accustomed to being alone. He did his best to take care of himself, cooking his own meals, cleaning, and doing his homework in the little spare time he had. But there was a hollowness in his heart that no amount of independence could fill. Today, as Zayden walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It wasn't a feeling he could explain, just a gut instinct that had been building all afternoon. As he passed by the river, which was no more than a few yards from his path, a sudden, loud noise reached his ears. It wasn't a normal sound, something desperate, something urgent. Zayden froze, his heart racing in his chest. Splash! Splash! The sound of water churning, splashing in frantic movements, followed by a faint, muffled cry. Zayden's eyes widened as he instinctively turned toward the source. He spotted a man struggling in the river, flailing his arms as he fought to stay above the freezing water. The current was strong, pulling the man further from the shore with every passing second. Zayden's heart sank. The man was in trouble, serious trouble. But what caught his attention next was something that sent a surge of anger through him. On the bridge, standing beside a patrol car, was a man in a police uniform. The officer, who appeared to be in his early 40s, was simply watching. There was no urgency in his movements, no sign of concern for the life of the man who was slowly sinking into the cold abyss. Zayden's eyes narrowed as he continued to watch. The officer did nothing. He simply stood there, his arms crossed, staring down at the drowning man. Zayden could see the man struggling to breathe, his face twisted in terror as he fought to stay afloat. But the officer didn't make a move. He didn't even call for help. Zayden's mind raced. His father's face flashed through his thoughts. The kindness in his eyes, the way he had always tried to protect Zayden, even though the world had taken him away far too soon. His father had been a good man, but he had been taken from them in a senseless act of violence. The killer had never been caught, and Zayden had always wondered if anyone would ever care enough to find justice for him. But here, in front of him, he saw another man's life hanging in the balance, and once again, no one was stepping up to help. Zayden's breath caught in his throat as a bitter realization settled in his chest. Justice wasn't just something that happened. It was something you had to fight for. Without thinking, Zayden made up his mind. He couldn't just stand by and watch. The officer had walked away, climbed into his car, and driven off without a second glance. Zayden didn't hesitate for a second. Ignoring the risks and consequences, he ran to the edge of the bridge and leaped into the water below. The shock of the icy river was immediate. The cold felt like 1,000 needles pricking at his skin, but Zayden pushed through, swimming with all his might toward the man in the water. Every stroke was a battle against the current that seemed determined to pull them both under. Zayden's muscles screamed in protest as the freezing water tried to swallow him whole, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. The man was close now, barely conscious, his body limp in the water. Zayden reached out and grabbed him, pulling him with every ounce of strength he had left. The river seemed to resist their every movement, but Zayden was relentless. He would not let this man die like this, not when he could do something about it. The effort was grueling. Zayden's arms burned from the exertion, and his body trembled violently from the cold, but he refused to stop. Slowly, painstakingly, he managed to pull the man toward the shore. With one final, exhausting push, they were finally on solid ground. Zayden collapsed beside the man, his breath ragged and shallow. He was shaking, his body aching from the effort, but there was no time to rest. He quickly turned the man onto his back and began performing CPR, pressing down on his chest with the same force he had seen in movies, hoping against hope that he could bring him back. The minutes stretched out like hours. Zayden's arms felt heavy, his hands slick with water, but he didn't stop. The life of a stranger was in his hands now, and he refused to let it slip away. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the man's chest rose with a sharp, desperate breath. His eyes fluttered open, and he gasped, coughing up water. Zayden let out a relieved breath as he sat back on his heels. He had done it. He had saved him. The man blinked up at Zayden, confusion flickering in his eyes. Then, his gaze softened, and he whispered in a voice barely above a whisper, "Thank you. You saved my life." Zayden's chest tightened with emotion. He had been the one to save a life, something that had seemed so impossible just moments before. The weight of the moment settled over him, and he realized, for the first time in years, that maybe there was still hope in this world. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Zayden helped the man sit up, propping him against a nearby tree to shield him from the biting wind. The man was weak, still shivering, but slowly recovering. Zayden took off his own thin coat and draped it over the man's shoulders, trying to give him some warmth as the wind picked up. Who are you?" Zayden asked, his curiosity piqued. He had just saved a man, but there were still so many questions left unanswered. The man took a deep, shuddering breath before speaking again. "My name is Arnold," he said hoarsely. "I'm 44 years old. I'm an undercover cop." He paused, as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I was investigating something big, but I was set up. They tried to kill me, but you saved me. Thank you." Zayden's mind raced as he processed the information. An undercover cop? What kind of investigation had Arnold been working on? What had brought him to this bridge today, and why had the officer simply abandoned him? But before Zayden could ask more questions, Arnold's voice grew faint, and his eyes fluttered closed as exhaustion took over. Zayden sat beside him in silence, watching as the man struggled to stay awake. There was something about this whole situation that felt off, something more to the story than met the eye. But for now, Zayden focused on keeping the man alive, doing his best to make him comfortable as the cold wind continued to bite at them both. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this act of courage, would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. And somehow, Zayden knew that this man, Arnold, wasn't just any stranger. His life was now tied to Zayden's in ways that neither of them could yet understand. The unseen witness. Zayden sat quietly beside Arnold, watching the man's shallow breaths slow as the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones. The wind howled across the riverbank, sending chills through Zayden's own frame, but he didn't move. He was too focused on the task at hand, making sure Arnold, the stranger whose life he had just saved, would be okay. There was a strange sense of responsibility that settled over him, as if fate had thrust them together in this moment. The boy and the man, two people from entirely different worlds, caught in a moment neither had expected. Arnold was still shivering, his teeth chattering as he rested against the tree, trying to regain his composure. Zayden could see the exhaustion in his face, the faint tremors that ran through his body as the shock of the situation settled in. The man had been through a lot, and even though Zayden had been the one to pull him from the river, Arnold's life, his survival, wasn't guaranteed just yet. He needed rest. He needed warmth. Zayden's thin jacket, which was barely enough to shield him from the cold, was now wrapped around the man's shoulders, but it would only do so much. "Are you okay?" Zayden asked, his voice quieter now, more compassionate. He had saved the man, but Arnold had saved him in a way too, giving him the chance to be someone who made a difference, someone who didn't stand by and watch another person die. Arnold blinked and then nodded weakly, his lips parting to form a shaky smile, though it lacked the strength to reach his eyes. I'll be all right. I think. His voice was strained, almost hoarse, but Zayden could see that he was trying to steady himself. Zayden had never known how to help people, not really. He had grown up taking care of himself, never needing or trusting anyone. But this felt different. He wasn't just offering a hand out of charity or pity, he was offering something real. He had done what needed to be done when no one else would. It made him feel stronger, more capable, and maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn the chaos of his life into something that mattered. Arnold coughed, breaking Zayden from his thoughts. The sound was weak, but it was enough to bring Zayden back to the present. You didn't have to do that, Arnold said, looking at Zayden with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. You risked your life to save me, and I don't even know why. Why would you do that for someone you don't even know? Zayden glanced down at the ground for a moment, unsure how to answer. He wasn't sure why he had jumped into the water without thinking, why he hadn't hesitated when the officer had abandoned Arnold. Maybe it was the memory of his father, a man who had always taught him to do what was right, no matter the cost. Or maybe it was the desperation he had seen in Arnold's face, the way he had been left to die without a second thought. Either way, Zayden didn't regret it. I don't know, he finally said, his voice soft but steady. I couldn't just leave you. No one should die alone like that. Especially not after what happened to my dad. Arnold's brow furrowed slightly. What happened to your father? He asked gently, the concern in his voice unmistakable. Zayden hesitated for a moment. He hadn't spoken about his father in years, not since the day he'd been taken away. It was still a raw, unhealed wound for Zayden, one that he often pushed aside. But something about Arnold's voice made him want to share, to let someone else in for once. My father he was killed, Zayden said, his voice low. It was a long time ago. I was just a little kid. They never caught the man who did it. My mom says we can't think about it, but it's always there, you know? He was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. But the police, they just let it go. Like his life didn't matter. Arnold's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could speak, a harsh sound pierced the air, tires grinding on gravel. Zayden's head snapped up, his body tensing instinctively. Arnold's hand shot out, gripping Zayden's arm with surprising strength. Get down, he hissed, his voice urgent. Before Zayden could react, Arnold pulled him to the ground behind the tree. Zayden's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was it the police? Was someone else coming to check on them? Through the gaps in the branches, Zayden peered out cautiously. A dark car had pulled up to the side of the bridge, its headlights cutting through the foggy air like a blade. Two men stepped out, both dressed in black suits, their movements deliberate and controlled. Zayden's eyes narrowed as he watched them. These men weren't police officers. They didn't look like they belonged to any official agency. They looked like something else, something darker, more dangerous. Arnold, still holding Zayden close, whispered harshly, "Those men, they're not just looking for me. They're looking for answers. And if they know I'm still alive, they'll come after both of us." Zayden's stomach tightened. He didn't understand what was happening, but it was clear that Arnold was in trouble, serious trouble. And Zayden had just unwittingly become a part of it. What do we do? Zayden asked, his voice barely above a whisper, fear creeping into his tone for the first time since he had jumped into the river to save Arnold. Arnold took a deep breath, then looked at Zayden, his expression resolute despite his weakened state. You stay quiet. You stay out of sight. And you trust me." The two men in black suits stood on the bridge for a moment, scanning the area. One of them seemed to be speaking into a walkie-talkie, his voice low and muffled. The other was pacing, clearly agitated. Zayden couldn't hear their words clearly, but the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just about saving Arnold anymore. There were bigger forces at play, forces that Zayden had never imagined. Arnold's hand remained tightly around Zayden's arm, guiding him further into the shadows of the trees. Zayden's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to stay calm, his mind racing to make sense of it all. What had Arnold gotten himself involved in? And why were these men after him? For what felt like an eternity, they remained hidden behind the tree, watching as the two men walked back to their car and drove off without noticing them. Zayden let out a breath he didn't know he was holding as the sound of the car faded into the distance. "We can't stay here," Arnold said, his voice low and firm. "They'll come back. And next time, they won't be so easy to escape." Zayden nodded, his mind spinning. He had saved Arnold's life, but now he was part of something far bigger than he could have imagined. And as much as he wanted to return to his old life, his quiet, lonely life in the slum, he knew that was no longer an option. Whatever was going on, Zayden had already stepped into a world of danger. And there was no going back. The weight of truth. Zayden sat with his back against a fallen log, watching the shadows lengthen across the ground as the evening settled in. The air had grown colder still, and despite the warmth of his breath, Zayden couldn't shake the sense that something much larger was unfolding, something he hadn't prepared for. He'd always lived his life in the margins, never seeking out trouble, but now, with Arnold beside him, all that had changed. The man he had saved was more than a stranger, he was caught in a dangerous world, one that Zayden didn't understand, and somehow, he was now a part of it. Arnold had insisted they leave the riverbank as soon as the men in suits had driven away. They had moved quickly, slipping through the growing darkness toward a rundown warehouse on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, a bleak, gray structure that had seen better days, but for the moment, it was shelter. The kind of place no one would think to look. As Zayden followed Arnold inside, he had noticed the man's movements were slow, his body still recovering from the cold shock of the river. But even with that, Arnold's eyes were sharp, calculating. The interior of the warehouse smelled of rust and dust. Piles of old crates were scattered across the floor, and the overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting a dim glow over everything. Arnold had found a small, empty corner near the back, and that's where they had settled for the night. Zayden didn't mind. It was cold, and the floor was hard, but it was better than being out there in the open, exposed to anyone who might come looking. "We need to talk," Arnold said, his voice still hoarse, but steadier now. He had taken off Zayden's jacket and hung it over a nearby crate to dry. "What I'm involved in, it's bigger than both of us, Zayden. I didn't want you dragged into it, but I don't have a choice anymore." Zayden looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean? You're just an undercover cop, right? Just investigating something?" The more he spoke, the more he realized how little he knew. Arnold had told him nothing about why he was on that bridge or what he had been doing there in the first place. All Zayden knew was that the man had been left to drown, and Zayden had saved him. Arnold ran a hand through his hair, his brow furrowing as he tried to find the right words. "It's more complicated than that. I'm not just any cop. I've been working undercover for years, investigating a criminal organization. They're huge, powerful. And their reach stretches far beyond the city. I got too close, Zayden. They found out what I was doing, and they've been trying to silence me ever since. Those men back on the bridge? They work for them." Zayden's stomach tightened. This was no ordinary case. No, this was something far worse. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something when I saved you?" Arnold's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Zayden saw real fear there. It wasn't the kind of fear you saw in someone who had made a mistake, it was the kind of fear that only came when you knew you were outmatched. Because now they know I'm alive. And they'll stop at nothing to finish what they started. It's not just my life at stake anymore, Zayden. It's yours too. The words hit Zayden harder than anything he had imagined. He had jumped into that river without thinking, without knowing what he was getting into, but now it was clear. He wasn't just a kid from the slums anymore. He was caught in a web, and the threads were tightening with every passing second. So, what do we do now? Zayden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't imagine a way out. Everything felt too big for him to handle. Too dangerous. What had been an act of simple courage was now a life-or-death struggle. Arnold hesitated, clearly weighing his options. We have to go on the offensive. I know some people, contacts, safe houses. We have to move quickly. I'll need your help, but I'm not going to force you into this. If you want to go home, I'll make sure you get there safely. But this isn't something that's going away anytime soon. Zayden stood in silence for a long time, the weight of Arnold's words settling into his bones. He thought about his life in the slums, about his mother, who worked tirelessly to keep them afloat. She had enough to worry about without him getting caught up in something dangerous. But at the same time, something inside him couldn't turn his back on Arnold. The man had done something Zayden could never forget, he had given him a glimpse of something bigger than survival. The idea of making a real difference. Finally, Zayden nodded. I'm in, he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. Whatever happens, I'm with you. Arnold looked at him with a mixture of surprise and appreciation. You don't have to do this. You're just a kid. You don't need to be involved in this world. I don't care, Zayden replied. I'm already in. And I don't want to be just some kid who sits back and watches while things happen to people. You said it yourself, this is bigger than both of us. If I can help, I will. Arnold's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Zayden saw a flicker of something like hope in the man's eyes. All right, he said finally. Then we move fast. We need to stay off the grid for a while. I'll get us supplies, a phone, a few resources to keep us going. But we can't trust anyone. Not even the cops. Especially not the cops. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy weight. Zayden had always thought of the police as the good guys, the ones who made the world safe. But now, he wasn't so sure. If Arnold's words were true, then the corruption ran deep. The men who had tried to kill Arnold had been officers, people who were supposed to protect others. And now, they were the ones hunting him. Zayden tried to process it all. In the span of a single afternoon, his entire life had shifted. He had gone from a lonely boy trying to survive in a world that had never given him a fair chance to someone with a target on his back. Someone who was now involved in a battle much bigger than any he had imagined. The hours passed slowly, and the warehouse grew colder as the night deepened. Zayden leaned against the wall, staring into the dark, while Arnold paced back and forth, making plans in silence. He had learned to keep moving, to think on his feet. There was no time to rest, not when danger was closing in. We need to get moving first thing in the morning, Arnold said, breaking the silence. I'll need to contact some people who owe me favors. You just need to stay low and stay quiet. Zayden nodded, though his mind was still spinning. What had he gotten himself into? More importantly, what would become of him once they were in the clear? Could he ever go back to the life he once knew, the one that seemed so far removed from this world of crime and corruption? Arnold's voice broke through his thoughts. One thing you need to understand, Zayden, there's no going back now. Once we start this, it's all in. The world you thought you knew? It's not the same anymore. Zayden looked at Arnold, a quiet resolve settling over him. He had always dreamed of something more, even if he didn't fully understand what that meant. Now, it was time to find out. The shadows close in. The next morning, Zayden woke to the sound of distant engines, their hum muffled by the heavy walls of the warehouse. The cold had wrapped around him during the night, and he could feel it still settling deep into his bones. He had managed to get a few hours of restless sleep, but his mind hadn't rested, not with the knowledge that he was in the middle of something far beyond his comprehension. The weight of the night before was heavy on him, and the fear of what might come next made it hard to breathe. Arnold had already risen when Zayden opened his eyes, his figure casting a long shadow against the crumbling warehouse walls. He was kneeling on the ground, looking over a map that seemed ancient, the edges torn and worn with age. His face was serious, his brows furrowed in concentration. It was as though the years of this hidden war had carved lines into his features, making him look far older than he actually was. "Morning," Arnold said without looking up, his voice quiet. "We need to move quickly. I've got a few calls to make, and we don't have a lot of time before they realize I'm still alive." Zayden rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue. He was just a kid, a 14-year-old boy, yet he felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice. The life he had known, the simple existence he had taken for granted, felt like a distant memory. Now, everything seemed charged with a sense of danger. Every corner, every shadow held the possibility of something that could change everything. Arnold looked up at him finally, his eyes meeting Zayden's with a flicker of something unreadable. "We need to be on the move," Arnold said again. "Stay close. Stay hidden. There's no telling how many people are looking for me by now. The more we're seen, the more dangerous it gets." Zayden nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. Arnold had been talking about this, danger, enemies, hidden forces, but Zayden hadn't fully grasped the scope of it. It was one thing to hear about it, but it was another to live it. The idea of constantly running, constantly hiding, was terrifying. The kind of fear that gnawed at you like a persistent ache. After a brief breakfast of stale bread and water, the two of them gathered what little they had, mostly just what Arnold had stashed away, and began making their way out of the warehouse. Zayden had never paid much attention to where things were in the city before, but now he had no choice but to learn. As they moved down narrow, abandoned streets, Zayden couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. It wasn't just paranoia, it was something deeper. His every instinct told him they weren't alone. They walked in silence, passing through the edges of town until they reached an old apartment building. Arnold took a glance around, scanning the surroundings as he led them inside. The building was run down, its walls covered in graffiti, the air thick with the smell of dampness and decay. It seemed like the kind of place no one would bother to look, but Zayden knew better now. Nothing was ever as it seemed. The apartment itself was sparse, with barely enough furniture to make it livable. But Arnold didn't seem to mind, he had an air of someone who had long since given up on comforts. Everything was a means to an end, a temporary stop on the path to survival. He immediately got to work, dialing a number on his burner phone. Zayden hovered in the background, unsure of what was happening but too caught up in the tension of it all to speak. After a few minutes, Arnold disconnected the call and turned to face him. "I've set things in motion," he said, his tone grim. "We're meeting someone tomorrow, someone who can help us get out of the city. But we need to keep a low profile until then. We can't afford to attract any more attention." Zayden nodded, his mind still spinning. "What happens when we leave? Where do we go?" Arnold paused before answering, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Once we get out of the city, we'll have a better chance. I've got contacts, people I can trust, people who can protect us. But we need to stay under the radar. These guys aren't just going to give up. They'll keep hunting." Zayden didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. He had already accepted the reality that the life he had known was over. But what worried him more than anything was what came next. The idea that he would never be safe again, that he would have to keep looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life, felt like a heavy weight. The next few hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity as they waited for night to fall. Arnold spent most of the time on the phone, talking to various people, arranging their next move, all while Zayden kept a watchful eye on the apartment building's windows. His mind wandered, thinking about his mother and the life he had left behind. How would she react when she found out he was missing? Would she even know? Would she be looking for him? He thought about the way her eyes had always looked when she was tired, so tired from working so much, and the way she had smiled at him, even when there was no reason to smile. But Zayden's thoughts were cut short when Arnold stood up suddenly, moving swiftly to the window and pulling the blinds aside. "What is it?" Zayden asked, his heart racing. "There's something happening outside," Arnold said quietly, his eyes scanning the street below. "Stay down. Don't make a sound." Zayden did as he was told, dropping to the floor instinctively. His mind raced as he pressed his back to the wall, trying to stay out of sight. He could hear muffled voices in the distance, too low for him to make out the words, but the tension in Arnold's body told him that something was wrong. They waited in silence, the minutes stretching out, each one a beat of their own heartbeat. Zayden couldn't tell how long they had been in the apartment, but he felt like he was suffocating. The world outside seemed to be closing in on them, tightening around them like a noose. Arnold's voice cut through the silence. "They found us," he said, his voice dark with certainty. "Get ready." Zayden's heart skipped a beat. He had known this was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold dread that settled deep in his stomach. The moment they had feared had arrived. The men who had been looking for Arnold, looking for both of them, were closing in. And there was nowhere to run. Without another word, Arnold moved quickly to the door, checking the locks and ensuring the windows were secure. Zayden followed his every movement, the urgency in the air suffocating him. He felt his pulse quicken, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, but he knew he couldn't. Not without Arnold. Not without knowing what was going to happen next. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, followed by the screech of tires as a car skidded to a halt just outside the building. "We need to move," Arnold said sharply, pulling Zayden to his feet. In a flash, they were on the move, ducking into a dark hallway at the back of the building. Zayden's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Arnold, trying to keep up with the man's swift movements, but everything around them felt like it was closing in. The men outside were getting closer. They wouldn't let them slip away this time. "Stay low, stay close," Arnold said, his voice steady despite the danger that was rapidly closing in. "We make it out of here, and we're not stopping until we're safe." Zayden nodded, his mind whirling, his body running on pure instinct. There was no going back now. The chase begins. The hallways of the dilapidated apartment building felt like a labyrinth. The cold concrete walls seemed to stretch endlessly, narrowing as they moved deeper into the shadows. Zayden's heart was pounding in his chest as he followed Arnold, trying his best to keep his footsteps light. Every creak of the floor beneath his shoes felt like it could betray their position. The only sound was the heavy breathing in the dim, almost suffocating air, and the faint hum of the city outside. Arnold moved with a sense of urgency but also with precision. He had clearly been in situations like this before. Zayden couldn't help but watch him closely, the way his eyes scanned every corner, the way he stayed low to the ground, moving fluidly and quickly as if he were a part of the shadows themselves. They reached a narrow staircase that spiraled upward. The building felt like it was about to collapse at any moment, the stairs creaking beneath them with every step. Zayden could hear the muffled voices of men talking, their words barely audible but their tone unmistakable. They were outside. Searching. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. Arnold held up a hand, signaling for Zayden to stop. He crouched down, his body tense, listening for any signs of movement. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. It was as if everything, every sound, every breath, was on a knife's edge, waiting to break the silence. Then, Zayden heard it, the low rumble of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from below. They were getting closer. The men who had been looking for Arnold were closing in, and it wouldn't be long before they reached the building's main floor. The fear in Zayden's chest flared into something primal, a rush of adrenaline that had his pulse racing. He felt alive, but in the most dangerous way possible. Upstairs. Now, Arnold whispered, his voice steady but urgent. Without a word, Zayden followed Arnold up the stairs. The two of them moved quickly, silently, as the sound of the men's footsteps grew louder. They were getting close. Zayden glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the men creeping up the stairs behind them, but when he turned, all he saw was darkness. The narrow staircase wound its way up into the shadows, and Zayden could only trust that Arnold knew where he was going. When they reached the top of the stairs, Arnold immediately checked the hallway for signs of movement. It was quiet, too quiet. Zayden's breath caught in his throat. This was it. They had made it this far, but now, it seemed like they were at a dead end. Arnold moved swiftly to a small, rusted door at the end of the hall. He pushed it open, revealing a small, cluttered attic space. It smelled musty, and the air felt thick with dust. But it was the kind of place that no one would think to search. The perfect hiding spot. They both slipped inside, and Arnold quickly closed the door behind them, securing the lock with a quick twist of his hand. Zayden didn't know how long they would have before the men outside discovered their escape, but he knew it wouldn't be long. His instincts told him that they would search the building thoroughly. If they found nothing on the main floors, they would start checking the attic. They had to be ready. The attic was cramped, filled with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. It felt like a forgotten space, one where time had stood still. Arnold moved to the far corner and began rifling through a box, pulling out a stack of old clothes and a few cans of food. Zayden watched him, his mind still racing. They were running out of time. Here, Arnold said, holding out a set of clothes. You need to change. We have to make sure no one recognizes us. Zayden took the clothes and quickly changed, feeling the weight of his decision sink in deeper. He wasn't just helping Arnold anymore, he was in this fight, whether he liked it or not. The idea of his mother, of the life he had left behind, seemed farther away with each passing second. It was as if he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. When he was finished, Arnold stepped back, sizing him up. You look different. That's good. We need to blend in, Zayden. It's the only way we'll make it out of here alive. The sounds from below were growing louder now, the voices of the men rising up the stairwell. Zayden's stomach twisted as his ears strained to catch the faintest sound. He felt the weight of their situation pressing in on him, every decision carrying consequences. Arnold's voice broke through his thoughts. Listen, Zayden. I need you to stay focused. This isn't going to be easy. They'll be looking for us everywhere. But we can't afford to freeze up. If we're going to make it out, we have to think on our feet. Understand? Zayden nodded, his gaze fixed on the man before him. Arnold was right. There was no time to hesitate. No time for second-guessing. This was survival now. There was no going back. The noise downstairs was growing more frantic now, the men beginning to search the building. Zayden could hear the floorboards creaking beneath their heavy boots. His body tensed, ready to move at any moment. The fear had become a constant hum in his ears, a pulse that ran through his veins. We need to go, Arnold said, his voice low but firm. He moved toward the attic window, peering through the grime-covered glass. We can't stay here much longer. I've got a car waiting for us a few blocks away. We'll use the back alley to get out of here. Zayden followed Arnold's movements closely, the weight of his words settling on him. There was no room for mistakes. One wrong move, and they were done for. But as much as he feared what might come next, he felt something else, too, something stronger. Determination. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking control of the narrative, about rewriting the story that had been written for him. The world had never given him much to work with, but now he had a chance to fight for something bigger. Let's go, Zayden said, his voice steady despite the anxiety that churned in his stomach. Arnold gave him a sharp nod, and together they moved toward the attic door. As Arnold carefully cracked it open, the sounds from below reached their ears again. The men were getting closer. There was no time to waste. Stay behind me, Arnold instructed. We move fast and stay low. Don't stop until we're out. Zayden took a deep breath, bracing himself. The chase had begun. And there was no turning back. The final escape. The cold night air hit Zayden's face like a slap as they pushed through the attic door. The sharp sting of the wind only sharpened the urgency that pulsed through his veins. Arnold moved swiftly, leading the way with his usual confidence, but Zayden could sense the tension in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. The building creaked behind them as they crept down the narrow staircase, trying their best to avoid making a sound. Zayden's heart beat erratically in his chest, his every step careful, but his mind racing. Outside, the city seemed deceptively quiet. The occasional car passed, its headlights slicing through the dark, but the streets felt unnaturally empty. Zayden knew it wouldn't last. It was just a matter of time before the men searching for them figured out where they had gone. Arnold motioned for him to follow closely as they slipped out the back door of the apartment, the cool night air enveloping them like a shroud. They ducked into an alley, moving with precision, staying as low to the ground as possible. Zayden tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that clawed at him, tried to focus on the footsteps ahead of him, Arnold's calm, steady pace. You're doing well, Arnold whispered, glancing back over his shoulder. But we can't afford to slow down now. Zayden nodded, the words settling heavily in his chest. He didn't feel like he was doing well. He felt like a shadow, a figure on the run, always looking over his shoulder, always hearing footsteps just behind him. The weight of the uncertainty was too much to bear, but he kept moving, determined not to let it break him. The alley twisted and turned, leading them through the backstreets of the city. The farther they got from the apartment, the more Zayden felt the weight of his decision pressing on him. What if they were caught? What if he made a mistake, if Arnold made a mistake? Stay focused, Arnold's voice broke through Zayden's spiraling thoughts. I know this city. We're close. Just keep moving. They reached a narrow road, the pavement slick with remnants of an earlier rain. Arnold glanced around, scanning the street for any sign of danger. Zayden could feel the sweat on the back of his neck, his breath coming in short bursts. His legs were starting to ache from the sprint, but he refused to stop. There was no stopping now. They turned a corner and found themselves at the edge of a large parking lot, tucked away behind a row of brick buildings. Arnold's car was parked in the far corner, the engine already running. Zayden could see the dark shape of it against the night, a quiet promise of escape. They were so close. But the moment they stepped into the open, everything changed. A screech of tires echoed through the streets, followed by the unmistakable sound of a car skidding to a halt. Zayden froze, his heart slamming against his ribs as he looked up. The headlights of a large SUV cut through the darkness, blinding him for a moment. The vehicle came to a stop a few yards away, and the doors flew open almost simultaneously. Figures emerged, at least 4 men, dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by shadows. But Zayden could see the weapons in their hands, the way they moved with a practiced ease that made his stomach drop. They had been found. Arnold cursed under his breath, grabbing Zayden's arm and pulling him toward the car. "Run," he barked. "Get in the car, now." Without thinking, Zayden sprinted toward the car, his legs pumping as fast as they could go. He could hear the men behind them shouting, the sound of footsteps pounding on the pavement growing louder. His pulse surged in his ears, each beat louder than the last. Every step was a risk, every breath a potential mistake. They reached the car just as the first shot rang out. Zayden ducked instinctively, his heart lurching as the bullet slammed into the concrete just inches from his feet. Arnold shoved him into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. Zayden barely registered the sound of the car engine revving as the tires screeched and the car jolted forward, racing out of the parking lot. The world outside was a blur of lights, the city's streets flashing by in a dizzying spin. Arnold was swerving between lanes, the car's tires screeching against the road as they raced away from the danger. Zayden's hands were trembling, his breath shallow as he looked over his shoulder, half expecting to see the SUV closing in on them. But they were in the clear, for now. "Hold on," Arnold grunted, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "We need to get to the safe house. It's the only place we'll be able to regroup." Zayden barely heard him, his mind still processing the chaos of the past few minutes. The shot that had nearly hit him, the men chasing them. It was all too much, too fast. He wanted to ask questions, to understand what was happening, but the fear had locked his throat. "How do you know they won't follow us?" Zayden finally managed to croak, his voice hoarse. Arnold shot him a grim look. "They will," he said. "They'll follow us as long as they can. But I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. They won't catch us if I can help it." For the next few minutes, the car roared through the city streets, weaving between lanes and making sharp turns to shake off any potential pursuers. Zayden could feel the tension in Arnold's body, the way his muscles were coiled tight, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He wasn't just driving, he was running, always looking over his shoulder, always trying to stay one step ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they turned down a dark side street and came to a halt in front of a nondescript house at the end of a quiet block. It looked like any other house in the neighborhood, small, unremarkable. But Zayden could sense the difference. There was a certain stillness about the place, as if it was waiting. "This is it," Arnold said, pulling the keys from the ignition and looking over at Zayden. "We're safe for now. But this doesn't end here." Zayden felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. He was safe, for the moment. But he knew, deep down, that the worst was still ahead. The men who were after Arnold wouldn't give up. They couldn't. And Zayden was right in the middle of it all. "We're not done, Zayden," Arnold said as they stepped out of the car, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken weight. "This is just the beginning. They'll come after us again. And next time, we'll be ready." Zayden nodded, the realization settling deep within him. There was no turning back now. This was his fight too.